I thought losing everything would break me. My marriage, my home, my sense of safety, gone. One quiet decision at a time. They didn't yell, they didn't warn me. They just walked away and left me with nothing. And that was the moment I realized I had no choice but to take my life back. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Hidden Chapters for more real-life stories and emotional insights. I used to believe that stability was something you built slowly, brick by brick, with the right person. I believed that if you showed up every day, paid your bills, kept your promises, and loved honestly, life would eventually meet you halfway. That belief carried me through most of my adult life. It shaped the choices I made, the risks I avoided, and the trust I gave far too easily. When I look back now, I realize how quiet my life was back then. Not empty, just predictable. Mornings started with the same mug of coffee, chipped on the rim, the sound of the kettle clicking off while the house slept. I worked part-time at a small accounting office, nothing glamorous, but steady. Numbers made sense to me. They followed rules. They added up the way they were supposed to. I liked that. In the evenings, I cooked dinner while my husband, Mark, watched the news with the volume just a little too loud. He always said he couldn't hear properly, but I think he just liked filling the silence. We didn't talk much during those hours. We didn't need to, or at least that's what I told myself. Our conversations had settled into familiar grooves: who was paying which bill, what needed fixing in the house, whether we were visiting his sister that weekend. On the surface, everything looked fine. Friends used words like solid and stable when they described us. We had been married for 17 years, long enough to stop celebrating anniversaries with anything more than a nice dinner. Long enough to assume that the other person would always be there, simply because they always had been. The house was modest, but it was mine in every way that mattered to me. A narrow driveway, a creaky wooden porch, and a maple tree in the front yard that turned a deep, burning red every autumn. I remember running my hand along the hallway wall sometimes, feeling the uneven paint where we tried and failed to do renovations ourselves. I thought of it as proof of effort, of shared history. Mark and I had bought the house early in our marriage. Back then, we were both working full-time, both laughing more, both convinced that we were building something together. Over time, things shifted in small, almost invisible ways. His job began to take up more of his attention. Mine became something he referred to as extra, even though my income paid for groceries, utilities, and most of the day-to-day expenses. I didn't argue. I adapted. That had always been my strength, or so I thought. There were no dramatic fights in those years, no slammed doors or shouted accusations, just a slow erosion of partnership. Decisions started being made without me. Financial conversations turned into brief updates rather than discussions. I noticed it, of course, but I also noticed how tired he seemed, how impatient he became when I asked too many questions. "Don't worry," he'd say, not looking up from his phone. "I've got it handled." Those words became a kind of lullaby, reassuring, dangerous. I trusted him because trust was easier than imagining betrayal, because questioning him felt like questioning the life I had built, and because part of me believed that being a good wife meant not rocking the boat. Mark had a way of speaking that made things sound final without sounding cruel. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive, he simply stated things as facts, and over time, I learned to accept his version of reality as the correct one. If I hesitated, he'd sigh and say, "You're overthinking it." If I pushed back, he'd smile thinly and reply, "You wouldn't understand, it's complicated." So I stopped pushing. I stopped asking. I let him take the lead in areas I once felt confident in, especially when it came to paperwork and finances. It felt like teamwork at the time, like division of labor. I didn't realize I was slowly handing over my voice. The first real shift came the year I turned 46. My office downsized and my hours were cut. Not eliminated, just reduced enough to make me uneasy. Mark suggested I take the opportunity to rest a little. He said we were fine financially, that he had things under control. "You've been working nonstop for years," he told me over dinner one night. "Let me take care of us for a change." I remember feeling grateful, relieved even. I told myself that this was what partnership looked like, one person stepping in when the other needed support. I didn't notice how easily that narrative replaced my own instincts. Days became quieter after that. I filled them with errands, housework, and small routines that made me feel useful. I kept the house spotless. I cooked meals from scratch. I told myself that contributing didn't always mean earning money. Still, there were moments, small nagging ones, when something felt off. Envelopes addressed to Mark only, phone calls he took outside, documents he filed away quickly when I entered the room. Whenever I asked, he brushed it off with the same calm certainty. Just work stuff. And I believed him because believing him meant I didn't have to confront the fear slowly growing in my chest, the fear that I was becoming invisible in my own life. I didn't know then that this quiet surrender was the first step towards losing everything. I didn't know that the trust I was so proud of would be used against me, and I certainly didn't know that the life I thought was secure was already slipping through my fingers, one unspoken decision at a time. Back then, I still believed love was enough to protect me. I thought losing everything would break me. My marriage, my home, my sense of safety, gone. One quiet decision at a time. They didn't yell, they didn't warn me. They just walked away and left me with nothing. And that was the moment I realized I had no choice but to take my life back. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Hidden Chapters for more real-life stories and emotional insights. I used to believe that stability was something you built slowly, brick by brick, with the right person. I believed that if you showed up every day, paid your bills, kept your promises, and loved honestly, life would eventually meet you halfway. That belief carried me through most of my adult life. It shaped the choices I made, the risks I avoided, and the trust I gave far too easily. When I look back now, I realize how quiet my life was back then. Not empty, just predictable. Mornings started with the same mug of coffee, chipped on the rim, the sound of the kettle clicking off while the house slept. I worked part-time at a small accounting office, nothing glamorous, but steady. Numbers made sense to me. They followed rules. They added up the way they were supposed to. I liked that. In the evenings, I cooked dinner while my husband, Mark, watched the news with the volume just a little too loud. He always said he couldn't hear properly, but I think he just liked filling the silence. We didn't talk much during those hours. We didn't need to, or at least that's what I told myself. Our conversations had settled into familiar grooves: who was paying which bill, what needed fixing in the house, whether we were visiting his sister that weekend. On the surface, everything looked fine. Friends used words like solid and stable when they described us. We had been married for 17 years, long enough to stop celebrating anniversaries with anything more than a nice dinner, long enough to assume that the other person would always be there simply because they always had been. The house was modest, but it was mine in every way that mattered to me. A narrow driveway, a creaky wooden porch, and a maple tree in the front yard that turned a deep, burning red every autumn. I remember running my hand along the hallway wall sometimes, feeling the uneven paint where we tried and failed to do renovations ourselves. I thought of it as proof of effort, of shared history. Mark and I had bought the house early in our marriage. Back then, we were both working full-time, both laughing more, both convinced that we were building something together. Over time, things shifted in small, almost invisible ways. His job began to take up more of his attention. Mine became something he referred to as extra, even though my income paid for groceries, utilities, and most of the day-to-day expenses. I didn't argue. I adapted. That had always been my strength, or so I thought. There were no dramatic fights in those years, no slammed doors or shouted accusations, just a slow erosion of partnership. Decisions started being made without me. Financial conversations turned into brief updates rather than discussions. I noticed it, of course, but I also noticed how tired he seemed, how impatient he became when I asked too many questions. "Don't worry," he'd say, not looking up from his phone. "I've got it handled." Those words became a kind of lullaby, reassuring, dangerous. I trusted him because trust was easier than imagining betrayal, because questioning him felt like questioning the life I had built, and because part of me believed that being a good wife meant not rocking the boat. Mark had a way of speaking that made things sound final without sounding cruel. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive, he simply stated things as facts, and over time, I learned to accept his version of reality as the correct one. If I hesitated, he'd sigh and say, "You're overthinking it." If I pushed back, he'd smile thinly and reply, "You wouldn't understand, it's complicated." So I stopped pushing. I stopped asking. I let him take the lead in areas I once felt confident in, especially when it came to paperwork and finances. It felt like teamwork at the time, like division of labor. I didn't realize I was slowly handing over my voice. The first real shift came the year I turned 46. My office downsized and my hours were cut. Not eliminated, just reduced enough to make me uneasy. Mark suggested I take the opportunity to rest a little. He said we were fine financially, that he had things under control. "You've been working nonstop for years," he told me over dinner one night. "Let me take care of us for a change." I remember feeling grateful, relieved even. I told myself that this was what partnership looked like, one person stepping in when the other needed support. I didn't notice how easily that narrative replaced my own instincts. Days became quieter after that. I filled them with errands, housework, and small routines that made me feel useful. I kept the house spotless. I cooked meals from scratch. I told myself that contributing didn't always mean earning money. Still, there were moments, small nagging ones, when something felt off. Envelopes addressed to Mark only, phone calls he took outside, documents he filed away quickly when I entered the room. Whenever I asked, he brushed it off with the same calm certainty. Just work stuff. And I believed him because believing him meant I didn't have to confront the fear slowly growing in my chest, the fear that I was becoming invisible in my own life. I didn't know then that this quiet surrender was the first step towards losing everything. I didn't know that the trust I was so proud of would be used against me, and I certainly didn't know that the life I thought was secure was already slipping through my fingers, one unspoken decision at a time. Back then, I still believed love was enough to protect me.
Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly, fed by repetition and routine, by the absence of alarm. Looking back, that's what makes betrayal so devastating. It hides inside what feels ordinary. Mark and I had settled into roles without ever discussing them out loud. He was the decision maker. I was the supporter. He handled the big picture. I handled the details of daily life. At least, that's how it felt. In reality, the details I handled were becoming smaller and smaller, while the big picture slowly disappeared from my view entirely. It wasn't just Mark, either. His family had always been close, close in that way where boundaries were implied but never stated. His older sister, Elaine, was especially involved in our lives. She lived across town, worked in real estate, and spoke with a confidence that made people listen. She had opinions about everything, and she delivered them as if they were facts. Elaine liked to say she was just being helpful. When she commented on our finances, our home, or my career choices, she framed it as concern. And because she was family, because Mark trusted her implicitly, I tried to do the same. "You know," she said once over coffee at our kitchen table, "you're lucky Mark is so good with money. A lot of women don't have that." I smiled politely, even though something in her tone made my shoulders tense. It wasn't admiration, it was assessment. Elaine had helped us refinance the house a few years earlier, guiding Mark through paperwork and legal terms I didn't fully understand. At the time, I was grateful. She explained things quickly, confidently, and always to him. When I asked questions, she'd answer, but briefly, as if translating something too complex to linger on. "It's standard," she'd say, "nothing to worry about." And again, I believed her, because believing was easier than admitting I felt excluded. Mark's trust in Elaine was absolute. He admired her independence, her business success, her decisiveness. When she spoke, he listened. When she suggested, he acted. I told myself that was normal. Families lean on each other. That's what they do. Over time, Elaine became a quiet presence in our major decisions, not always physically there, but involved, a phone call here, a suggestion there. When Mark talked about future plans, her name slipped into the conversation naturally. "Elaine thinks this is the right move. Elaine says the market's shifting. Elaine can take care of it." I rarely heard "we" anymore. There was a moment, small but sharp, that stays with me now. One afternoon, Mark asked me to sign a few documents. He placed them on the dining table, already clipped together, a pen resting neatly on top. "Just routine stuff," he said, "house-related." I flipped through the pages, the words blurring together, legal language, fine print, sections highlighted in yellow. I paused, my finger resting on a paragraph I didn't understand. "Should I read all of this?" I asked. Mark exhaled slowly, not angrily, but with a hint of impatience. "It's already been reviewed. Elaine handled it. We're just formalizing things." I hesitated, not because I suspected anything specific, but because a quiet instinct was tapping at the back of my mind, asking to be acknowledged. "It's okay," he added softer now. "Trust me." I signed. That moment didn't feel dramatic. It didn't feel like a turning point. It felt like marriage, like compromise, like choosing peace over friction. Life continued much the same after that. Days passed, seasons changed, the maple tree in the front yard lost its leaves and grew them back again. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything was shifting. Mark became more distant, though I couldn't point out when it started. He stayed later at work, took more calls behind closed doors. When I asked how his day had been, his answers were shorter, less detailed. Fine, busy, same as always. I filled the gaps with assumptions, stress, responsibility, midlife fatigue. I told myself that marriages went through phases, that this was just one of them. I reminded myself of the years we'd already invested in each other, the life we'd built. And still, the sense of imbalance grew. Money conversations became one-sided. I noticed that my access to accounts had changed, not dramatically, but enough to make me feel like a guest instead of a partner. When I asked about it, Mark reassured me with practiced calm. "It's just easier this way. You don't need to worry. Everything's covered." Elaine echoed the same sentiments when I mentioned it to her casually one afternoon. She smiled, stirring her coffee slowly. "Mark's protecting you," she said. "A lot of women would be grateful." Grateful. That word settled heavily in my chest. Gratitude implies a debt, and I was beginning to feel indebted for a life that was supposedly mine. The more I look back, the more I see how subtly trust was used to disarm me. No one demanded my silence. No one threatened me. They simply positioned themselves as the experts, the protectors, the ones who knew better. And I let them, because questioning felt like ingratitude, like failure. There's a psychology to this kind of dynamic, how confidence can overshadow doubt, how authority can replace partnership if you're not paying attention. I wasn't paying attention, not fully. I still believed I was safe. I still believed that love, familiarity, and shared history formed an unbreakable shield. I believed that people who said they cared wouldn't deliberately harm me. What I didn't realize is that harm doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it waits until you've handed over everything willingly. By the time I began to sense that something was truly wrong, the groundwork had already been laid, the trust had already been given, the signatures had already dried, and I was standing in the middle of my life, unaware that the floor beneath me was no longer mine. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come as a shock. It came as a question, one that refused to leave me alone. It started with the mail. I was sorting through the usual stack one morning, utility bills, grocery flyers, a charity request, when I noticed an envelope with our address, but only Mark's name on it. That wasn't unusual by itself. What caught my attention was the return address. It wasn't from a bank we used regularly. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling a small, unfamiliar tightness in my chest. I didn't open it. I set it aside on the counter, telling myself I'd ask Mark about it later. Later came and went. Over the next few weeks, similar envelopes appeared, different institutions, legal-looking logos, always addressed to Mark, always arriving when he wasn't home, always disappearing before I had a chance to mention them. I told myself not to read into it. I told myself I was imagining patterns where there were none. Still, I began to pay closer attention. I noticed how Mark stiffened slightly when the mail arrived, how he sorted through it faster than before, how he asked casually, "Anything important today?" without really waiting for an answer. I started feeling like a guest in my own home, carefully observing a life that no longer fully included me. One afternoon, while cleaning the study, a room Mark had gradually claimed as his own, I found a folder tucked behind a row of old books. It wasn't hidden exactly, just placed where someone who wasn't looking wouldn't notice it. The folder was thick, heavy. My hands trembled as I opened it, even though I didn't know why. Inside were copies of documents I recognized immediately: property papers, refinancing agreements, legal correspondence. My name appeared on some of them, on others it didn't. I sat down in the chair by the desk, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I read slowly, carefully, forcing myself not to panic. The language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Ownership percentages, authorized signatory, power of attorney. Power of attorney? I stared at those words, my mind scrambling to remember when I had agreed to something like that. I flipped through the pages, searching for context, for explanations, for dates that might make sense of it all. That's when I saw my signature. It was unmistakably mine, slanted slightly to the right, a little rushed, signed on a date I remembered only vaguely, a day Mark had asked me to sign routine paperwork at the dining table. A cold wave of realization washed over me. I hadn't read it. I closed the folder quickly, as if touching it any longer might make things worse. I put it back exactly where I found it, my hands numb, my movements slow. That night, I barely slept. Questions circled my mind relentlessly. Why hadn't Mark told me? Why was Elaine involved? What exactly had I signed away? Every explanation I tried to form ended in the same hollow reassurance. There must be a reasonable explanation. In the morning, I asked Mark about the folder. I kept my voice light, casual, as if I were asking about groceries or weekend plans. I was organizing the study and saw some house papers, I said, pouring coffee into my mug. Can you explain what they are? For a fraction of a second, his expression changed. It was subtle, just a tightening around the eyes, a pause that lasted a beat too long. Then it smoothed over. Oh, those. Old stuff. Nothing to worry about. Some of it looked recent. He shrugged. Paperwork lingers, you know how it is. I waited for more. An explanation, reassurance. Instead, he turned his attention back to his phone. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger yet. It was awareness. Over the next few days, I began to notice things I had previously ignored. Bank statements that no longer came in the mail, online account passwords I didn't have access to, conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room. I reached out to Elaine under the guise of curiosity, asking her general questions about refinancing and property ownership. Her responses were polished, professional, and evasive. Everything's in order, she said. Mark's being very responsible. Responsible, another word that implied I shouldn't interfere. The sense of being managed rather than partnered with became impossible to ignore, and with that realization came a slow, creeping fear. I wasn't just being left out, I was being positioned. One evening, while folding laundry, I overheard Mark on the phone in the next room. He didn't know I was home. His voice was low, controlled. Yes, she signed it. No, she doesn't know the details. Elaine made sure it was clean. My chest tightened. I stood frozen, a towel clutched in my hands, listening as my life was discussed like a transaction. She trusts me, he continued. She always has. That sentence broke something in me. When he noticed me standing there, he hung up quickly, too quickly. Who were you talking to? I asked. Work, he replied, automatically. This time, I didn't accept it. That night, lying awake beside him, I stared at the ceiling and allowed myself to consider the unthinkable, that the people I trusted most were not just keeping secrets, but actively planning around me. Psychologists talk about cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when reality contradicts our beliefs. I felt it acutely then. Part of me clung desperately to the image of my husband as a protector. Another part, newly awake, recognized the danger of that belief. I didn't know the full truth yet, but I knew enough to understand that something fundamental had been taken from me without my consent. And once that awareness took root, there was no going back.
The truth didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded the way a bruise does, slowly, darkening over time, revealing the full extent of the damage only after it was too late to pretend it didn't hurt. The morning everything became undeniable started like any other. I woke before Mark, slipped out of bed quietly, and went through the motions of my routine: coffee, window light, the low hum of the refrigerator. I remember noticing how calm everything felt and how strange that calm seemed given the storm building inside me. I had decided I needed answers, real ones, not reassurances wrapped in familiar words. So I did something I had never done before. I went online and called the county records office. My hand shook as I dialed. I half hoped I'd reach a voicemail, that I'd be spared the confirmation I feared. Instead, a woman answered cheerfully, asked how she could help, and within minutes was pulling up property records associated with our address. I gave her my name first. There was a pause. Typing. Another pause. "And the property address?" she asked. I repeated it, slowly, as if saying it differently might change what came next. "Well," she said carefully, "the current recorded owners are Mark Williams and Elaine Parker." Elaine Parker. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had closed in on itself. "And my name?" I finally managed. Another pause, shorter this time. "I'm not seeing your name listed on the deed," she replied gently. "It appears ownership was transferred last year." Transferred. The word echoed in my head long after the call ended. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, my coffee untouched and growing cold. The house around me felt suddenly unfamiliar, like I was sitting in someone else's living room without permission. I replayed the dates she'd mentioned. Last year, the day I signed those papers, the folder in the study, the words power of attorney. They hadn't just excluded me, they had erased me. When Mark came home that evening, I was waiting for him. Not pacing, not crying, just sitting at the dining table, the same one where I had signed away my future without knowing it. "We need to talk," I said. He hesitated, just for a moment. Then he sat across from me, his posture guarded, his face already preparing for defense. "I know," I continued. "I know the house isn't in my name anymore." Silence stretched between us. Finally, he sighed, not in guilt, but in irritation. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." That was the moment something inside me went completely still. "What weren't you supposed to find out?" I asked, even though I already knew. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if I were the problem that needed managing. "It made sense. Elaine and I discussed it. Financially, legally, it was the smartest option." "You transferred our house," I said slowly, "without telling me." It wasn't our house anymore, not the way things were going. The words landed like a physical blow. "What does that mean?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked at me, with a detachment I had never seen before. "You weren't contributing," he said, "not financially. And if something happened to me, things could get complicated." "So you solved that by taking my name off the deed?" "You signed the paperwork," he said flatly. I laughed then, a short, disbelieving sound that surprised even me. "I trusted you. That's not the same thing." Elaine arrived unannounced. The next day, she didn't knock. She never did. She walked in like she belonged there, her expression calm, professional, almost kind. "I hear you're upset," she said, sitting down across from me. Upset, as if I'd misplaced my keys. "I stole my house," I said. She folded her hands neatly on the table. "No one stole anything. This was a legal transfer. You signed." "You knew I didn't understand what I was signing." She tilted her head slightly. "You didn't ask." That sentence revealed everything. In that moment, I saw the full picture with brutal clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was strategy. They had relied on my trust, on my desire to keep peace, on my fear of appearing ignorant or difficult. They had wrapped their intentions in concern and professionalism, knowing I wouldn't challenge them. Mark stood behind her, silent. "What happens now?" I asked. Elaine's voice softened as if delivering good news. "Mark and I have decided it would be best if you moved out. Temporarily, of course, just until things settle." "Moved out? Of my own home? I have nowhere to go." "That's not our responsibility," Mark replied. That night, I packed a suitcase with trembling hands, not because I agreed, but because I understood something crucial. I had already lost everything I thought anchored me: the house, the marriage, the illusion of safety. As I closed the front door behind me, the sound echoed louder than it ever had before. I stood on the porch, staring at the maple tree, its leaves beginning to change color. For the first time in years, I wasn't being managed or reassured or spoken over. I was alone. And beneath the fear, beneath the grief, something unexpected stirred: clarity. They had taken my home, they had taken my marriage, but they had not taken my will to fight. The first night after I left, I slept on a friend's couch with the lights on. It wasn't because the room was unfamiliar, it was because the darkness felt too honest. In the dark, there was nothing to distract me from the truth I was trying not to fully absorb: that my life, as I had known it for nearly 2 decades, had ended without my consent. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over: every conversation, every signature, every moment I had chosen silence instead of discomfort. My chest ached with a grief that felt physical, like something had been torn out and left a hollow space behind. Shock does strange things to the mind. Part of me still expected Mark to call, to apologize, to say there had been a misunderstanding. Another part of me knew, deep down, that the man I thought I knew no longer existed, or maybe he never had. In the morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Elaine. "Let's keep this calm and respectful. Emotional reactions won't help anyone." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking, not with sadness this time, but with anger. That anger frightened me at first. I had spent most of my life avoiding it, swallowing it, reshaping it into patience and understanding. But now it rose up uninvited, hot and sharp, demanding to be acknowledged. I let myself feel it. I felt angry at Mark for betraying me so quietly, angry at Elaine for weaponizing her intelligence, angry at myself for trusting them both without question. The anger didn't make me cruel, it made me awake. Over the next few days, the full weight of my situation began to settle in. I had limited access to money, no home, no clear legal standing. Friends were kind, but their concern came with questions I couldn't answer yet. How could he do this? Didn't you know? What are you going to do now? I didn't know. That uncertainty was terrifying. I cried in the shower so no one could hear me. I cried while folding borrowed clothes. I cried in the car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles hurt. But somewhere between the tears, something else began to form: a thin, fragile determination. I started reading. Not novels, not distractions. I read about financial abuse, about coercive control, about how often women sign away rights under the guise of trust and partnership. I learned that what had happened to me had a name, and that naming it mattered. Psychologists say that betrayal trauma cuts deeper when the harm comes from someone you depend on. That resonated painfully. My body still reacted as if I were unsafe, even in calm moments. Loud noises startled me, silence made me anxious. My sense of self had been destabilized. But knowledge gave me something grounding. This wasn't weakness. This was manipulation. I made a list one afternoon, sitting at my friend's kitchen table, not of what I'd lost, but of what I still had. My mind. My voice, my ability to learn. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I contacted a legal aid office, my voice shaking as I explained my situation. I expected skepticism. Instead, I heard concern. "You're not the first," the woman said gently, "and you're not powerless." Those words landed softly, but they stayed. For the first time since leaving the house, I slept through the night. The sadness didn't disappear. It lingered in quiet moments, when I saw couples holding hands, when I passed familiar streets, when I smelled the same brand of coffee Mark used to drink. Grief isn't linear. It comes in waves, unpredictable and exhausting. But the shock was fading. In its place came clarity. I began to see how often I had minimized myself to keep the peace, how often I had mistaken compliance for kindness, how deeply I had internalized the idea that asking questions made me difficult. I wasn't just mourning my marriage. I was mourning the version of myself who believed that trust alone could protect her. One evening, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My face looked older somehow. Not in years, but in awareness. My eyes were sharper. Tired, yes, but alert. "They don't get to decide how this ends," I said out loud. It wasn't a declaration yet, more like a promise whispered to myself. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had shifted from something that paralyzed me into something that pushed me forward. And in that shift, I felt the first hint of something I hadn't felt in a long time: agency. They had taken my home, they had taken my security, but they underestimated one thing. I was still here, and I was done disappearing. Taking action didn't feel brave at first. It felt clumsy, awkward, like trying to walk on a leg that had been asleep for too long. Every step was uncertain, but standing still felt worse. I started with small things, practical things. I opened a new bank account in my own name, depositing the little money I still had access to. I updated my resume, even though my hands trembled as I typed, unsure whether anyone would take me seriously after years of working reduced hours. I gathered every document I could find: old tax returns, emails, scanned copies of papers I barely remembered signing. Each piece of information felt like a fragment of myself I was reclaiming. The legal aid office connected me with a family law attorney who agreed to review my case at a reduced fee. Sitting in her office for the first time, I felt exposed, like I was confessing something shameful rather than describing a crime. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "What you're describing fits a pattern. It's not uncommon, and it's not your fault." Those words loosened something tight inside my chest. She explained the options slowly, carefully. Some of them were discouraging. The documents I had signed were legally binding. Undoing them would be difficult. Elaine had been careful, very careful. But not everything was airtight. There were inconsistencies, timing issues, questions about informed consent. "You were systematically excluded from information that directly affected your rights," she said. "That matters." For the first time, I felt like someone was standing on my side of the table. The next step was confrontation, not emotional, not explosive, but deliberate. I requested a meeting with Mark and Elaine, neutral location, public space, no surprises. They agreed. We met at a small cafe near the courthouse. Elaine arrived first, perfectly composed. Mark followed, avoiding my eyes. I noticed how different he looked to me now, smaller somehow, less certain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I stated facts. "You removed my name from the deed without full disclosure. You leveraged my trust to gain control of shared property, and I'm pursuing legal action." Mark's face drained of color. Elaine's smile tightened. "That's unnecessary." "No," I replied. "What was unnecessary was lying to me." There was a long pause. "This will get messy," Elaine warned. "I'm already living in the mess you created. The difference is, I'm not pretending anymore." Walking away from that table felt surreal. I half expected my legs to give out. They didn't. In the weeks that followed, things escalated quickly. Letters were exchanged, phone calls made. My name began appearing again, in conversations, in negotiations, in places it had been deliberately removed from. Mark reached out privately one evening. "I never meant to hurt you," he said over the phone, his voice unsteady. "I just didn't think you'd handle it well." That sentence said more than he realized. "You decided that for me. That's the problem." I hung up before he could respond. As the process unfolded, I noticed something unexpected. The fear that had once consumed me was being replaced, not with confidence exactly, but with self-respect. Each boundary I set reinforced something I had forgotten I possessed. I wasn't asking for permission anymore. There were setbacks, days when the paperwork overwhelmed me, nights when doubt crept in, whispering that it would be easier to let it go, to start over quietly, to stop fighting. But then I'd remember the way Elaine had said, "You didn't ask." And I'd remind myself, I was asking now. Psychologically, reclaiming control after betrayal isn't about revenge. It's about restoring agency. It's about proving to yourself that you can survive truth even when it shatters your illusions. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning. I didn't know how it would end yet. I didn't know what I would win or lose, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would no longer be a silent participant in my own life.
When the truth starts surfacing, it rarely does so quietly. It ripples outward, touching people who were never meant to see beneath the surface. And once it's out, it can't be folded neatly back into place. Mark tried damage control first. He called mutual friends, framed the situation carefully, used words like misunderstanding and overreaction. I recognized the strategy immediately. Minimize, soften, redirect. It was the same tone he had used with me for years. But this time, I wasn't isolated. People started asking questions. The right ones. Elaine's reputation as the capable, ethical professional began to wobble under scrutiny. Not collapse, but wobble. And in communities like ours, perception matters almost as much as legality. I received messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some cautious, some apologetic, a few quietly supportive. One woman, a former colleague of Elaine's, asked to meet me for coffee. She looked nervous when we sat down, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear us. "You're not the first," she said softly. "I wish I could say you were." That sentence stayed with me long after we parted ways. As the weeks passed, the legal process forced Mark and Elaine into positions they couldn't fully control. Documents had to be produced, timelines explained, decisions justified. The story they had told themselves and others began to fray. Mark reached out again, this time in person. We met in a small park, sitting on opposite ends of a bench like strangers. "I thought I was protecting us," he said, staring at the ground. "I didn't think it would turn into this." I listened, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to hear the truth without the filter of reassurance. "You protected your control, not our partnership." He didn't argue. That silence was its own admission. Emotionally, this phase was exhausting. Vindication didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy. Each confirmation of wrongdoing also confirmed the depth of the betrayal. Justice, I learned, is rarely clean. It drags grief along with it. Still, something inside me steadied. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was reclaiming narrative. For too long, my story had been told about me, not by me. Elaine attempted one final maneuver. She proposed a settlement that would allow me partial compensation, but only if I signed a non-disclosure agreement. Silence in exchange for relief. I read the offer twice, then declined.
"I'm done trading my voice for comfort," I said through my attorney. That decision came with consequences. The process grew longer, tenser, but it also solidified something essential. I was no longer afraid of being seen as difficult. In therapy, I learned how deeply betrayal can distort self-perception, how easy it is to internalize blame when someone rewrites reality convincingly enough. Naming those distortions helped dismantle them. I wasn't naive. I wasn't weak. I was systematically misled. As more details emerged, the full scope of Elaine's involvement became undeniable. She hadn't just advised, she had orchestrated. Mark hadn't just followed, he had agreed. Watching that truth become visible was painful, but it was also freeing. The power they once held over me relied on secrecy, and secrecy had finally been stripped away. One evening, as I walked back to my temporary apartment, a small place I'd rented with money from a short-term contract job, I realized something quietly profound. I felt safe. Not because everything was resolved, but because I trusted myself again. By the time the legal chapter closed, I had already begun another one. Quieter, less visible, but far more transformative. This was the part no paperwork could resolve, the part that happened inside me. For a long time, I believed healing would feel like relief, like waking up one morning and realizing the pain was gone. Instead, it felt more like learning a new language, slow, awkward, and filled with moments where I doubted myself. I had to relearn how to listen to my instincts. For years, I had overridden them in the name of harmony. I had confused discomfort with drama and silence with strength. Untangling those beliefs took time. It took patience, and it took compassion for the version of myself who had done the best she could with the tools she had. I spent a lot of time alone in those months. Not lonely, but intentionally quiet. I took walks without headphones, sat with my thoughts instead of drowning them out, paid attention to what my body reacted to, tightness in my chest, shallow breathing, that subtle pull of unease I had once ignored. Psychologically, this was integration, taking what had happened and allowing it to inform, rather than define, my future. I noticed changes in how I spoke. I no longer softened my questions. I no longer laughed nervously when I needed clarity. When something didn't make sense, I said so. When I didn't agree, I didn't explain myself into exhaustion. There was grief in that process, too. I grieved the years I had spent believing love meant self-erasure. I grieved the friendships that quietly faded when I stopped playing the role they were comfortable with. Growth has a way of rearranging relationships, but it also attracts new ones. I met people who didn't flinch at my boundaries, who didn't interpret my confidence as aggression, who listened without needing to dominate the conversation. Those connections felt unfamiliar at first, lighter, steadier, safer. I began to understand something crucial. Trust isn't about blind faith. It's about mutual transparency. One afternoon, while journaling, I wrote a sentence that stopped me cold. I am not afraid of being alone anymore. That realization felt like freedom, not because I no longer wanted companionship, but because I no longer needed it to feel whole. I had learned that my worth wasn't anchored to partnership, approval, or accommodation. It was anchored to self-respect. I also began to see my story not just as something that happened to me, but as something that could help others. Patterns emerged as I reflected. How often women are conditioned to defer, how expertise is used to intimidate, how trust can be quietly weaponized. Psychology calls this meaning-making, turning trauma into insight, pain into perspective. I didn't excuse what was done to me. I didn't romanticize it, But I no longer carried it like a wound that might reopen at any moment. It had become a scar, a reminder not of weakness, but of survival. Looking back, I see now that the moment they thought they had taken everything from me was the moment they lost their power. Because what they couldn't account for, what they never anticipated, was my capacity to grow beyond the version of myself they had underestimated. I didn't just get my life back, I redefined it. Moving forward didn't feel like a dramatic rebirth. There was no single morning where I woke up transformed, confident, untouched by the past. Instead, it felt like steady ground returning beneath my feet, slowly, quietly, one ordinary day at a time. I built a new routine, simple, intentional. Morning walks before work, real breakfasts instead of rushed coffee, evenings spent reading or cooking meals I actually enjoyed, not meals designed to keep someone else comfortable. These choices may sound small, but to me they were revolutionary. Every one of them said the same thing: I decide now. I went back to work full-time, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I wanted my independence to be tangible. There was dignity in earning my own money again, in knowing exactly where it went, in understanding every document I signed. I asked questions unapologetically. I reread contracts. I took my time. No one rushed me anymore. Occasionally, memories would surface without warning. A certain street, a phrase someone used, the sound of a pen clicking before a signature. When that happened, I didn't push the feelings away. I acknowledged them. Trauma doesn't disappear when ignored. It softens when met with honesty. I also learned to forgive myself. That was harder than forgiving them. I forgave the woman who wanted peace more than clarity. I forgave the woman who believed love required sacrifice without limits. I forgave the woman who didn't know that trust must be mutual to be safe. She wasn't foolish, she was hopeful. As time passed, people began asking me how I was doing, not cautiously anymore, but genuinely, and I realized I could answer truthfully. I'm good, I'd say, and I meant it. Not because life was perfect, but because it was mine. I didn't rush into new relationships. I didn't need to. I took the time to learn what safety felt like in my body, what respect sounded like in conversation, what equality looked like in action. I set boundaries early. I paid attention to how people responded to them. The right people didn't resist. One evening, sitting alone in my apartment with the windows open, I caught myself smiling for no reason, not the polite smile I used to wear, a real one, the kind that comes from quiet contentment. That's when I understood something profound. They hadn't just left me with nothing. They had unknowingly given me everything I needed to rebuild: clarity, courage, and an unshakable sense of self. I no longer measured my worth by how much I endured. I measured it by how well I protected myself. I no longer mistook silence for strength. I used my voice calmly, clearly, without apology. If there's one lesson my story holds, it's this: betrayal can take your past, but it doesn't get to claim your future unless you let it. Taking my life back didn't mean reclaiming what was lost. It meant choosing who I would be after the loss. And that choice changed everything. This is my story. This is what shaped me, and this is what I learned.